Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to you here in the Parliament. I'm going to be focusing on rather general ideas, but ones which I feel are important. In the documents we've received, it is clear that there are causes for concern. There are geopolitical risks. It is true that there's a first phase now in terms of the agreement between the US and China, which is less worrying, but there are still concerns. And then we've got US imports now being allowed, which will take the pressure off Europe as well. Then with regard to Brexit, the news isn't great either. We know that the new British Prime Minister doesn't want to have a Canada-style relationship with the EU, but wants to have a closer relationship with us and the Middle East, even though the situation in Iran is worrying. We know that the housing market is still worrying for the Spanish, but I won't go into that now. But given all of these things, we seem to be facing a situation which is a bit like the Japanese sluggish decline. We've got low inflation, we've got low interest rates and so on, but we're still trying to maintain a certain amount of employment, and even though unemployment levels in Spain are intolerable, the experts are saying that what we need is more fiscal or budgetary measures, but these measures are limited in what they can do. Look at public debt, for example, and we've got new risks like digitalization and the fight against climate change, and those things are going to need more investment and also more compensation for productivity declines. That's going to be difficult. So if that's the case, what is the policy of the central bank going to be in the medium and longer term in this context of slowdown and deceleration, which has already been made clear? This is a fact, and could actually increase as time goes on.
Thank you very much for your question. You are right in that downside risks are multiple, and when some of them phase out, new risks come up. This is a factor of how our global economy evolves, and I agree with you that the trading related risks associated with the trade war between the US and China has faded and abated, but now we clearly have those news from China on coronavirus, and we are still very uncertain about the outcome that it will have on the Chinese economy and more globally on our world economy. So we need to be again, on this one, cautious, attentive, and patient. These pandemics have a tendency to affect, and then once they're contained, the economy bounces back. So we have to look at the impact on the way down, but also on the way up. This was clearly what has happened with SARS back a few years ago. We need to see how this one evolved and how closely related in terms of timing, contamination it is. And how it's propagated elsewhere. On the what you have described, this sort of low inflation, low interest environment, the low productivity as well, it is a concern. And the reason we have our monetary policy as it is and as packaged as it is precisely to try to address those issues. I would not, however, compare the current situation of the euro area to Japan whatsoever. Japan has had a period of deflation that lasted for decades. Inflation expectations, which are so important, are much lower than the inflation expectations of euro area citizens, which still stand at around 1.7%. In our region. So we're talking about a very different situation where real interest deflated from inflation in Japan is much higher than what we have here in the euro area. So I wouldn't be too negative, too downbeat about the current macroeconomic situation. We have seen signs of stabilizations. The forward output survey, even in manufacturing, is relatively positive and has been for the last 5 months. There are a few signs that are on the positive side. We, as I said, need to support it and be patient on that front and continue to support the economy by keeping financing costs at a low level.
Thank you very much. Now, Engin Eroglu.
Ja, sehr geehrte Frau Lagarde, ich freue mich.
Madam Lagarde, I'm very pleased to see you in our committee once again. It's great for us to be able to discuss things on a regular basis. So I'd love to talk to you about the ECB again. And I'm pleased to see that you are bringing the ECB closer to citizens and advertising the ECB with ordinary citizens, and hopefully therefore meaning that citizens will become more clued up about monetary policy and consider this in future elections to elect people who are in the know. Now, so when it comes to this, I'd like to look at the record of the ECB. We've got 4.5 billion euro, an expansive policy since 2015, with purchases in the region of 27 billion, and then 960 billion, and then 2018 the ECB stopped these bond purchases. 2019 in November once again resumed the purchase in the region of 20 billion monthly. So we've got the balance sheet growing all the time, meaning that its role in monetary policy becomes ever more important, and your role becomes ever more important with a long mandate. So I wonder where this is heading with these purchases. Things have become more difficult on markets for bankers. If you've got a big player buying a lot of it, then it's possible for you to set rates in a way that is beneficial for you. Now, when we look at the situation, we see that in some states they've been able to take advantage of it. I agree. The sun is shining, things are rosy, but in other states that's not the case. They have not been able to make the most of this situation. So what are you going to do about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our mandate, I will repeat it ad nauseum, but I'm very firm on that, is to pursue price stability. And our monetary policy in all its components is designed to reach this mandate. So with that in mind, the design of asset purchase programs and collateralized refinancing operations takes into account two things. How effective is it? And second, how risky is it? And we clearly have to take the risk component into account with a risk control framework whereby risks are mitigated, very closely monitored. And as regards our asset purchases, we have limited the credit risk by purchasing only assets with sufficient credit quality, by setting limits to the amount that we purchase from each issuer and issuance, and by ensuring diversification. It's one of the questions that your Greek colleague was asking about. When are the Greek bonds going to be eligible? Well, because we do manage risk and because we have to keep that portfolio safe and solid, we do that in a very cautious way, and we monitor that on a very regular basis. So that's on the risk side of things. On the efficiency of it, I have said earlier, but I'm happy to repeat that the price stability objective that we pursue is also intended to sustain the economy, to help the creation of jobs, to help additional growth, to support investment. And one of the reasons why the financing of investment, whether it is by companies when they buy new equipment, new machine tools, or whether it is households when they change apartment or buy their first apartment, if this financing cost is so low and has been lower over the course of the last 5 years, it is because of the monetary policy. And in that sense, it has helped a lot.
Thank you very much. Now, Gunnar Beck.
Sorry about my technical incompetence here. Two questions, really. Oh, right. I'm going to speak in German now. So good morning, Madam President. Forgive me. In September
of last year, we agreed in our assessment that the ECB, under your predecessor, was barely sticking to the terms of the treaty. In future, would you think that breaching the treaty is going to be in everyone's best interests, and would you not shrink from doing that? You are sticking to the 2% target, and there's not a genuine legal base for that in the treaties. Now, this is an apparent contradiction. Is that because the ECB set itself a 2% inflation and regards that as more binding than other things which are in the treaty? If that is the case, can that really be? And are there treaty provisions on monetary policy which the ECB deems to be as sacrosanct as the stability imperative of the 2% inflation? Now, secondly, compared to GDP, in this monetary area, the Bank of England had 17%, the Fed 27%, and the ECB 40%. And the trend is going rapidly upwards. Can you give any historical examples, any historical precedents for printing paper long-term being good for growth in the economy?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to clarify two things. First of all the instruments that have been used by the ECB have been taken within the boundaries of its mandate in life before mine as head of the ECB. This has been confirmed by the Court of Justice of the European Union in relation to the announcement of the OMT, which was never effectively implemented and used. And more recently, the Public Sector Purchase Programme, the PSPP, which is a component of the Asset Purchase Programme. The Court has also reasserted their proportionality in relation to the specific objectives of the ECB's monetary policy. Purchases of government bonds under the PSPP are also compatible with the prohibition of monetary financing, which is laid down in Article 123 of the treaty. So those are the sort of legal parameters and court decisions within which the monetary policy instruments have been used, and I think those decisions are binding, and their terms are very carefully scrutinized by all those who are interested. That's point number one. Point number two, you referred to the 2% target, and that was mentioned earlier. So I just want to clarify one thing. The price stability in 1998 was at the time defined and explained, and the framework within which it would be measured was determined as below 2%. That was the 1998 initial determination. And you were talking of times when we had massive inflation compared with what we have today. So that was the sort of background for that. In 2003, that framework was reviewed under a relatively short strategy review, and it was then defined, because from zero, or maybe below zero, and 2%, there is a large margin. So in order to guide expectations and in order to allow for that space for policy purposes, it was defined as close to but below 2%, which, because you've observed what other central banks do around the world, which is different from what others do. whether it's the Bank of England, whether it is the Fed, it's much more closely defined as 2%, and it's currently under review at the Fed level. So those were two clarifications that I wanted to point out to you to indicate within which parameters we operate and what is currently the framework. And it is that framework that we are going to review as part of our monetary policy strategy. With that, clearly, we operate within our mandate, under the treaty, with due regard to the case law that has been decided, that is binding upon us. And, I'm a lawyer by background. I follow the rules. But we have to explore all corners of those rules in accordance with the rules and in accordance with court decisions.
Thank you very much. Now, Pedro Silva Pereira.
Thank you, Madame Lagarde. Let me, to begin with, congratulate you for conducting such an important strategy review in the ECB. As you said, in line with the mandate of the ECB and consistent with the launch of the new European Green Deal. But I want to congratulate you as well for what you haven't changed, the support given by monetary policy to economic growth. My questions, however, are on fiscal policy. You said in your initial intervention that in the current situation of modest growth performance and modest momentum, and I'm quoting you, not only monetary policy, but also fiscal policy has an important role to play. Now, this is not, of course, a new request from the European Central Bank. So I would like to ask you, how do you assess the response of fiscal policy in the Eurozone? And how would you assess as well the macroeconomic consequences of a failure from fiscal policy to do what it is needed in order to support economic growth? And secondly, we know that your message is particularly designed for those who have room of maneuver in terms of fiscal space. Is this a message only for Germany and the Netherlands, or would you say that some other countries still have and now have room of maneuver to do more in terms of fiscal policy?
Well, thank you very much for this question. I was trying to think of a sport analogy to describe for you how we believe that fiscal policy, appropriately calibrated, can actually enhance the monetary policy. And I was hesitating between the parallel track or the handing the baton, and it's something in between, actually, because if they can operate in good synchronization, they actually help each other. And this is certainly the case when fiscal policymakers operate in an environment where financing costs are so low. So yes, we have said, and we have indicated clearly that where there is fiscal space, it would be appropriate for policymakers to actually use that fiscal space in order to support the euro area economy. And I'm not going to indicate which exactly of those countries they are in the euro area that have the fiscal space. I would simply observe that some of those countries that have fiscal space have now embarked upon using some of that fiscal space now and in the near future in order to actually support the economy, improve productivity, invest in capacities that are needed. And that is certainly welcome from our perspective as ECB, because, contributing to raising productivity and investing in those long-term imperatives that are education, that are proper broadband, that are artificial intelligence, that are all the tools of the new environment that will make our European economies stronger and more autonomous is clearly in everybody's interest.
Thank you very much. Now, Damien Kareme.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Bonjour, Madame la...
Thank you very much, Chair. Madame Lagarde, I put a question to you when you took office, and it's very good to be able to come back to these things today. When we talk about inflation, jobs, employment, housing, that is exactly what people who have taken to the streets to defend the climate and the environment, or big French companies who say that the damage is going to be so great that the damage is going to be uninsurable. The whole principle of market neutrality in the selection of assets is an important area. Are we going to get a revision of monetary policy to look again at these principles? Because what they've done has not been neutral when it comes to the package of assets, because it's pro-carbon and bears down in terms of a risk to the environment. How will the ECB, with its supervision, contribute to a sustainable economy? Do you think the ECB will make research one of its priorities? Thank you.
Réponse oui. Je vais vous en dire un peu plus parce que c'est pas suffisant.
Thank you very much for those questions. The first point is the one which I raised earlier with Mrs. Rechner, and that was the impact of environmental issues on price stability, and in what way can this best be factored in. As things are, the figures may not be perfect, but if you look at the 70,000 economic works which have been published, you'll see that quantitatively it's 0.1% which deal directly with the economic cost of environmental change. And it's clear that when it comes to research, there is a need for more work at the link between climate change and the economy and prices, productivity, all of those elements, all of those factors which are pertinent given the mandate which is ours. And that was the research dimension and the impact which work has on the stability, price stability objective, which is our mandate. Then secondly, there are things which could be questioned, even the neutrality, market neutrality. Certainly we are able to act. Pension funds, for example, own funds of the European Central Bank, and pension funds action has been done, and emissions being given to the managers of the pension funds to act in that way. The indexes can be replaced by carbon neutral indexes. On the reserves, again, we'll be looking to see to what extent combating climate change can be part of that. Monetary policy as such, across the portfolio, 80% of the portfolio is sovereign bonds. So there is no major impact, and the remaining 20% corresponds to purchases of corporate assets. And there the principle of neutrality is respected, and I think it must be kept. There are different views around the issue, I know, in other banks, other central banks, and in the governing council, but this must not prevent us from looking around. You then have the whole aspect of the debt, because the collateral debt of the European Central Bank at present, as I was indicating to a previous speaker, very attentive risk measures, very calibrated to protect the portfolio from risk. But climate change-related risk is not specifically targeted. It will perhaps require some time for that to mature, for those indexes which are required to really emerge They're beginning to emerge now. Perhaps they could be consolidated, but with the help of national central banks who are moving into that area, I believe we will be able to act to get better coverage of risk. We are looking at price stability, but we're getting into the field of risk management.
Ms. Fitzgerald.
Thank you. Welcome back, Madame Lagarde, to the ECON committee. And I want to welcome the consultations that you're going to have in Member States and your comments on housing, because I think they will form quite a part of consultation, given what our citizens are experiencing. We're now in the post-Brexit situation and trying to finalise the trade talks over a short period. And I wanted to ask you, how do you feel the banks in the Eurozone are prepared to deal with Brexit, particularly in a no-deal scenario? And secondly, how important do you think it is that we have close regulatory cooperation or alignment with the UK on financial services post-Brexit? The other question I wanted to ask you relates to the issuer limit in the quantitative easing programme, the 33%. And the ECB holds a significant portion of the bonds in issuance in some member states, such as Ireland, Portugal and Germany, and is close to reaching the issuer limit in these countries. How can you ensure, how can the ECB ensure that these countries are not disproportionately affected by the 33% issuer limit, and that the ECB is buying what is justified by their capital key? Have you considered increasing the 33% issuer limit in the quantitative easing programme? Or could I ask you, are there circumstances that you could see arising where you might consider removing that limit or changing it, perhaps some adverse circumstances, either in an individual country or across the Eurozone, Euro area?
Thank you very much. First of all, on the post-Brexit situation, I just want to mention for you the fact that we at the ECB are prepared. We have taken actions and precautions, and we certainly have, with the Bank of England, the appropriate swap arrangements so that currencies in both euros and sterlings will be available and will not contribute to a situation of volatility or disruption. The banks themselves have been reminded over and over in all corners of the euro area to anticipate, to take their precautions and to be prepared for what might be in December the settlement of a relationship that will affect trade predominantly, because the financial regulatory issues and the banking issues are separate from the trade negotiations that are happening at the moment. We are, in a way, lucky that Basel III is a harmonizing platform on which banks are regulated, according to which they are supervised, and we very much hope that the Brexit will not be an opportunity for a race to the bottom, and that the regulatory environment created by Basel III in particular will be respected to the letter and in spirit as well between the parties. The close relationship that had been built over the course of time will be different. Let's face it. As the UK has decided for Brexit, it clearly cannot be the same relationship. It cannot be business as usual. Equally, I believe that because of the intelligence, because of the information, because of access, I very much hope that we can continue to have a good arm's length, but good and solid and deep relationship, because I think it is in the interest of the euro area to maintain that relationship. On the issuer quantitative limit, clearly we have to respect the proportionality, we have to respect limits and keys as they apply and as they are resulting from principles that have been approved. I really don't want to think of circumstances where we would have to anticipate or examine whether or not limits have to be exceeded. But I would say que sera, sera, and we have to face any circumstances and deliver on the mandate that we have under those circumstances. So I don't want to put myself in that particular moment at this point in time. I hope that our policy will be so efficient and the fiscal authorities will be so receptive as well that we will by all means avoid such a situation.
Thank you very much. Now, Johan van Overveld.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Madame Lagarde, for being here. I have a statement and a question for you, and of course I would like you to comment on both. The statement I would like to make is based on statements of two of your colleagues, Mr. Panetta and Mr. Mesh. Mr. Panetta said here in the European Parliament during his hearing in December, and I quote, "The ECB has key responsibilities regarding financial stability, not least because financial stability is a precondition to price stability." And Mr. Mersch recently in a speech in Luxembourg said the following, and I quote again, "The increase in asset and housing prices is excessive and results from the exceptionally long period of extremely accommodative monetary policy." Now, if I combine those two statements, there's an iron logic in it. The accommodative or extremely accommodative monetary policy leads to elevated asset prices, which threaten financial stability, which in its turn is a threat to price stability. So what they are saying basically is that the ECB is derailing at the moment with respect to its prime objective of price stability. That's the statement I would like you to comment on. And then the question has to do with your remarks on higher productivity, which are, of course, very true and very right to say. But isn't the ECB contributing to having capital and labour stuck in lower productivity entities, and that there is a kind of a natural survival of lower productivity entities within the economy, thanks, between brackets, to the policies of the ECB? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have to be attentive to financial stability, and we are. We look at all components of the economic and financial landscape within which our primary mandate is, again, price stability, not financial stability. But it's clearly an area that we have to watch, and the interconnections between the two are, as you know, subject of huge scrutiny and review by academics and by policymakers as well. We do not see currently evidence of misalignment across asset classes in the euro area beyond the easing of financial conditions intended by the ECB's measures. I say in the euro area. And we don't see strong sign of housing bubbles that would be forming in the euro area as a whole. Now, there are residential real estate prices that in some urban centres are increasing significantly, and we are clearly micro or localized measures could certainly be considered by the local authorities. When supply is short, financing conditions are favourable, demand is high. Well, clearly you have price increases that need to be addressed, and the supply side needs to be addressed clearly. There was an ESRB warnings, if you remember, that was issued in September 2019 on that very specific point. So we are attentive to those risks, and we are clearly warning at the level of the ESRB. Is that threatening housing affordability in some corners? Possibly, which is why the supply side has to be addressed by the authorities. But, for the moment, I've expressed my views many times over now on this particular point. The monetary policy that we have in place is clearly intended to maintain that price stability, to reach the level where we regard our objective as satisfied, and to sustain growth and to sustain the creation of jobs and to encourage investment. And that takes me to your second question, which has to do with the contribution of the ECB to low productivity. through the financing cost that would make life of those unproductive companies actually easy. It's the concept of the zombie firms that would be whose life would be facilitated by low-cost financing. Again, we don't see any evidence of that. And what we need to do is to make financing available and encourage the financing of investment by all, the people, households, all companies, and we can't distinguish between a company that is not doing well and a company that is doing well. It's not for us to do that. We have to make the financing available. I would call your attention to one study that was conducted recently in Denmark, where negative rates have been negatives for even much longer than in the euro area, which concluded to the fact, and they did an empirical study, that financing was not a major contributor to the formation or the increase of zombie firms as a result.
Thank you very much. Now, Eero Einalungoma.
Madam Lagarde, I also would like to welcome your announcements to improve the ECB communication efforts. However, a strong and effective ECB communication policy should, of course, go beyond only explaining monetary decisions. And one of the important things is that ECB ought also to inform public about the risks facing Eurozone and our financial markets. I have here a small quote by Danielle Noy, previous chair of the ECB Supervisory Board. She said some time ago that one of the key risks for the euro area banking system is conduct risk, which includes money laundering. Conduct risk, yes. And I have to say that I fully agree with this, because the anti-money laundering, which you already mentioned, is something which is totally unacceptable, and it's still present in our Eurozone financial markets. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that perhaps ECB has also got some bad publicity during the recent AML scandals. The SSM regulation is clear. ECB should cooperate with national competent authorities in the fight against money laundering. I have two questions for you. The first one is that could ECB do more in tackling the problem of anti-money laundering? And the second one is, you have a great experience from your years of IMF head, and you know very well the US system here. Are we too soft in financial crimes in European Union? Could we take some experiences learned from US experiences?
Well, thank you very much for your question on AML-CFT, because clearly anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism are key components in order to maintain the integrity of the banking and financial systems in general. And the current supervisory fragmentation and differences in supervisory practices in the AML-CFT fields can severely undermine the stability of European banks, and thereby the ECB's supervisory effectiveness, particularly in cross-border capital. So for this reason, the ECB, within the remit of its supervisory functions, takes prudential implications of money laundering risks very seriously. But it is not the ECB that is responsible for enforcing legislation or prevention of the use of the financial system for the purpose of money laundering and terrorist financing. The legislative steps taken so far to enhance the European AML-CFT framework will, in our view, not be enough to effectively prevent money laundering and terrorist financing in the banking sector, and further steps are necessary to improve the effectiveness of AML-CFT framework, in particular for those cross-border activities. So we very much welcome the ongoing discussion that is taking place, and we stand ready to support that. Let me just suggest two things, which in my view would contribute to reinforcing the fight against money laundering and financing of terrorism, that would strengthen the autonomy of Europe in that respect, and hopefully would be more effective. Number one, in terms of legal basis on which to ground action, I don't think a European directive is the right response. A European regulation would be the right response, because the transposition then, and the multiple variety of transpositions that I'm sure Madame Nouy was referring to, would not happen, or not in the same way. Second is, there should be more coordination between the various authorities in charge of enforcing AML-CFT in their national jurisdiction. And there should be a better instance, agency, whatever it is, that actually coordinates and has enforcing power at a certain level. The ECB does not have that authority, does not have that enforcing capacity, but it's clearly lacking.
Thank you very much. Now, Danuta Hübner.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and pleasure listening to you, Madame Lagarde. I would like to ask you about the international role of euro, because we, for 2 decades, basically, we have been leaving this issue to market forces. It put us on the sort of second in ranking of the important global currencies, but we are very far behind the first currency. And now, 2 years ago, Jean-Claude Juncker put the issue of strengthening the role of euro in the global context also on the political agenda, and then the Commission issued 2 communications where they made, I think, rather strong case for strengthening the role of the euro. So my question to you is whether you still think that it should be left to the market forces, or there is a space for supportive policies and reforms that could bring it. And also remembering that you are not only monetary policy, you are also payment system institution. So could ECB also be part of this exercise? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that question, which I don't know if it's the last question, but it's one on which I would like to spend just a little bit of time, because I think it's critically important. The euro is one of the key international currencies that are regarded as internationally tradable, and it is, as you said, ranked second, way behind the dollar. It increased in proportion in the basket of currencies that are determined to value the special drawing rights, and it increased in the proportion of reserve held by central banks around the world, up to a point where it stabilized and slightly declined. So it's roughly stable, but it's second, way behind the dollar. Being a leading international currency gives you responsibilities. It gives you benefits as well. And we can go through the list of that. But it is certainly contributing to the autonomy and to the strength of the nation or the region from which it is issued. And in that respect, I would like to mention 3 areas where we need to continue making progress and where your role is key. If we want to get to that stage where the euro is regarded as the or one of the 2 lead currencies on the international scene. One is, we will not have an international euro, so to speak, at that level, unless there is a deep and liquid capital market. If you look at history, and I gave a speech yesterday on that topic, so I'm very keen on that. But if you look at history, one of the factors that helped the dollar remove the sterling from the leading position where it was, one of the factors, not the only one, but a major contributing factor, was the depth and the liquidity of its capital market. You call it CMU. The capital market union has to happen fast, particularly with what is happening on the European scene and the departure of the United Kingdom. I think that if that is not a triggering factor to engage all of us into forming the capital market union, I don't know what else we need. So that's number one. Number 2, you're completely right to refer to payment systems. We need to have fluid, instant, efficient payment systems within the euro area, and we are heading in that direction. TIPS, our target system that allows for access by banks to central bank liquidity, is in place, works well. It needs to be adopted on a much broader basis. We need to have a retail payment system that is working better, that is smooth, and that is made here. That's the second dimension. The third dimension, which I would also mention, which I think is key, is the ability that we have to fight against cyber risks. In a way, it's part of the payment system architecture, but it goes beyond that. And clearly on those three particular chapters, Capital Markets Union, payment system, and ability to defeat cyber attacks, we need to be strong if we want the euro to be that international currency of reference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to the last speaker, just let me, these are two issues that are very close to the heart of this committee. As a matter of fact, we have requested two reports on the Capital Markets Union and on the international role of the euro. Of course, that's still subject to the authorization of the COP, but we all hope it will go well because we are all aware of the importance of these topics, and I'm glad we had a chance to discuss it with you. Gilles Boyer, the last speakers, and then I'm really sorry, but I'm afraid we will not have time for Catch the Eye because we also have votings afterwards.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm sorry it wasn't supposed to be the last question, but now it is. Thank you for coming. And we're coming to Frankfurt on Wednesday. We look forward to that encounter. Thank you for saying communication is going to be a top priority. Of course, ECB is not the only institution which has to raise its game when it comes to communication, but I'm glad that you've taken it very much to heart. Particularly in a technical and complex area, it's very difficult, even if you jot things down quickly. Of course, when you try to simplify things, sometimes we can make simple things more complicated, of course. Now, if I could be a little bit moderate than what's been said, negative interest rates. There are many of us around the room here who approve the policy, which we feel is in line with the euro mandate and the circumstances. But the fact remains that being paid to borrow money is something intellectually difficult to get your head around. How do you explain that in terms of common sense without getting into the technicalities? So I have two questions which occur to me as an MEP, as a taxpayer, and as an MEP about the possible implications of this policy. First of all, it gives increased access to credit for individuals, which is a positive thing. People can borrow. But I'm asking, how would banks fare with an increase in interest rates if hundreds of billions of lending for long term at very low rates for people's mortgages is also out there? Because you can see that represents a systemic risk for them, the banks, in the event of the interest rates going up. Very low rates. It often means that people are investing in riskier products. People who are not necessarily economically literate, because they feel they have to invest, because otherwise their money is going to depreciate in value. But there is a risk there. What would happen if there were herd events in that kind of area? Because, of course, it's not simply things are not necessarily going to go the way that we would like, and there may be such herd events. Thank you. Thank you. Let me take those questions. Thank you for saying that monetary decisions taken so far were legitimate and necessary to support prices and to get to price stability set out under the mandate. Now, the first risk which you identify is that households in particular would have excessive recourse to borrowing, to credit, and would then be vulnerable to an increase in interest rates. 2 points to respond. That is a real risk. And in the face of that, there are two measures which can and are being taken. One is macro and micro prudential. In other words, there are ratios which are used to do the calculation, the amount of the loan, the ability to pay back. There are certain ratios, how much you borrow and the asset. And there are certain central banks, in particular the French central bank, and the finance ministers have recalled the fact, have repeated that those measures are necessary, particularly with regard to the maturity of the loan, the duration of the loan, which can be an extra risk for families which are borrowing at low rates over a very long term. So macro and micro-prudential measures. That was the first side. Secondly, I talked about the need to be patient, and we hope that the macroeconomic situation is not just going to stabilise, but is going to gradually improve, and that the monetary policy, backed up by good fiscal policy, will allow an increase in activity, and that we'll have inflation where we want it and get a monetary policy which is more conventional in the longer term. But it is evident that in that context, festina lenti, as someone said, you cannot slam on the brakes, because otherwise, given the risks that are there for families, companies and the economy at large. So prudence is at a premium, given that risk. And then there is a third element, which started really in December. It's the so-called two-tier system, so that negative interest rates don't affect banks, provided they stay within reasonable reserve limits. And now there are compulsory legal reserves which banks have to hold. Looking for the yield, the quest for yield, which applies to other institutions as well, has to be anticipated. It's not for the central bank to take measures which preempt monetary policy in order to preempt what may happen. However, in investment policy, hedging policy, portfolio diversification, and indeed in identifying a development strategy for the institutions, there is the financial environment in which they operate, and that has to be factored in order to anticipate possible risks. Therefore, I think festina lenti, go softly, is perhaps the best way to get a real improvement in the economic numbers. Thank you.
Very much. So we close here the hearing. So I thank again Madame Lagarde for being here and answering all our questions. And I take just a 1 minute break to allow the change of setting here. Okay.